Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about these swords right here. These are Katana from a company called Swordier. And before I get into the video, a couple quick disclaimers. One, these are review samples that were sent to me for free. If you think that makes me biased, you know at the start. And two, I study Japanese style swordsmanship. I've done it for a minute. I've talked about swords on the internet for a long time. Still don't fancy myself an expert. You should keep that in mind as you hear my babbles. Another thing you should note is that these are not super expensive swords. They're $159 for the through hardened variety and $129, as I understand, for the differentially hardened variety. And so I'm going to test both of them kind of at the same time. Do bear in mind, though, that they're not particularly expensive swords, and that's something that should, well, weigh in on your decision about if it's worth it or not, which incidentally is kind of the point of this video. I'm not trying to change hearts and minds here. I'm trying to give you close-ups of the bits and bobs, fits and features so that you can see the build quality, talk about moving it around as a practitioner, talk about cutting with it, with normal things and then abnormal things. And hopefully at the end of that, you have some idea of if this sword is worth your money, or one like it anyway. Which I should also note, I know I'm pretty heavy-handed in the disclaimer section here, but this is also important. There are 4 swords that I'm evaluating in totality. Now, initially, this started as 1 through hardened variety katana, 1 differentially hardened variety katana, but in the process of testing, I noted that the Koshirae seemed a little bit loose. I reached out to sword friend Alex, who is the owner, proprietor, somebody who runs or is affiliated with Swordier, and who I had the pleasure of doing a live stream with not too long ago. I'll link that as well in the description down below. But I mentioned, hey, the Koshirae are a little loose on here. That's something I'm going to make mention of. And he said, that's not normal. Sorry that happened. And he sent me out some fresh samples to evaluate. So the ones that I've pushed to failure and used the most have been the secondary samples. The original ones had some Koshirae issues. But there's some things I'm going to note about that, because I've given both of them. It's also given me a great chance to look at the consistency between multiple different batches of what should be the same sword. And there are some variations here which are going to play a large part in what I have to say about these swords. But anyway, on with the reviewing. So I'll start with the Koshirae, the end cap here, and this is a little different because I'm reviewing effectively 4 swords, and so I'll try to keep straight what I'm talking about. But if I start with the differentially hardened variety sword first, this has what looks like the Hanwei Oni katana themed fittings on it. And oddly, one set of fittings, the newer set, came with a slightly more zazzy sheen on it. So they have a marginally different patina. I imagine these are made in different batches, but one is a little glossier than the other. Apart from that, the rest of the overall fit of the Koshirae was a little bunchy. None of them had particularly great transitions, but at the same time, they all felt pretty good. And if I move over to the Koshirae on the Iron Sparrow, I believe it's called, the through hardened variety sword, it's a little bit more of a plain looking fitting. Oddly, on a more expensive katana. The less expensive sword has more ornate fittings on here, which seems a little odd, but I digress. The point is, this simpler looking through hardened blade had about the same fitment overall, and the fitting was of a similar quality, also marginally different in terms of looks on the second sample, but a little bit more consistent. None of the overall 4 Koshiraes really had a great fit or great transitions. And by that I mean the Ito should line up perfectly with the ledge of the Koshirae. Nothing should be overlapping. And it was all either a little bunchy or had some ledges on here. Not the worst that I've ever seen, which is, I suppose, high enough praise for a sword that's under $200. But the main concern that I had with the Koshirae is that all of them are loose. So even the second samples, very quickly, they came unglued. Whatever adhesive they're using to hold and secure down the Koshirae was insufficient to really hold it for very long. Basically, the first time I did any cutting, the Koshirae was coming loose. Now, fortunately, this is something that if you're attentive, you can catch, and you can put a dab of glue or something in there to secure it. You can lacquer the Ito if you're concerned about it. But the Koshirae has some sort of adhesive on it. That didn't hold up, and the Ito isn't tied tight enough to keep it all together. And so those two things are things that should ideally be addressed. Ideally, the Ito's a little tighter, and that'll help hold the Koshirae on, and whatever adhesive is used under the Koshirae, if it's going to be used, it should be quite a bit stronger than it is, because none of the 4 examples worked well. And when I was going and testing the swords to push to failure, more or less the Koshirae came off while I was cutting water bottles with them, like the very early in their use, I should say. In doing basic EI, this is also a concern. It doesn't mean that it's going to pop off at your first use, but it does mean that over prolonged usage, it's really dubious how long it's going to survive without some sort of intervention. And so if you do choose to get one of these and you're concerned about it, like I said, you can put some glue underneath it to secure it yourself. You can lacquer the Ito as well. That'll hold things down quite a bit better, keep things from moving around. So anyway, that's number one concern with the Koshirae. I'm disappointed with the bunchiness of the Ito, but really, really concerned with the fact that the Koshiraes come off and don't seem particularly well secured, and didn't even after a second attempt, which after I called out the Koshirae as the problem and the second set was sent, I would have thought that that would have been a recipe to really nail it, but even when it's called out in particular, it still came in a condition that was concerning. Now I'm going to talk about the handle and the Ito. I should note that I like the shape of the handle. It fit in my hand well. It wasn't too big, it wasn't too small, it wasn't bulbous or clumsy feeling, and at least in terms of the general shape. I was disappointed by the tightness of the Ito, though. I could move it around by pushing it with my hands. I'd love it to be a lot tighter. I talked a little bit about the consequence of that with the Koshirae coming off, and also what you could do to potentially remedy it by spraying it with some lacquer or something like that. But you shouldn't have to. Ideally, these swords are tight. Ideally, it doesn't move around at all. That's not a standard that is often reached in swords at any price point, but I would at least love it if it were tighter here. Now, I would describe this as a passing grade, passing being that it doesn't feel like it's going to fall apart immediately, but it does give me some concern that it's not going to be particularly durable, not hold up very well over time without some sort of intervention like lacquering it or putting wax in it or something to tighten the Ito up. So liking the shape is one thing, but the Ito tightness is also a little bit of a miss here. That said, the shape of the diamonds and how it was all put together wasn't too bad. It was really the tightness that was a concern. It also wasn't the loosest that I've ever felt, so do bear that in mind. It gets a passing grade, but kind of just in the passing section. I really think that Ito tightness could be improved a little bit here. I should also note that the cores all seem to be not cracked when I took a look at them, and later they did crack. So the wood that it's made of is pretty durable. It took a lot of abuse with the through hardened variety sword to get it to start to fall apart and break, but when it did, the tang started breaking through and punching me in the hand, which wasn't particularly fun. But it took a lot of punishment before it got there. The cores, whatever wood they're using, however they're assembling them, doesn't seem too bad. The next bit I should talk about is the Fuchi. Like I said, they have different fittings. I can't say that I was impressed with really any of the fitment here. It wasn't egregious or really off or anything to complain about, frankly, in a sword that's under $200. It's only that some of these transitions are really nailed by some companies. For example, the Ryan sword, I've looked at ones that are $150, and a lot of the fitment of the Fuchi Koshirae tend to line up a little better on some of the swords from another company in the same price point. Ronin Katana, their RK series swords as well. I've seen some that have had overall pretty good transitions and felt pretty good and had tighter Ito. So it can be had at other swords in this price point. The handle so far has been a letdown, and at least consistently it's been a letdown. So I'd imagine if there was improvement, I would see it consistently, because all of them had about the same level of tightness. The second samples that I got did feel a little bit tighter than the first, but all of them are just not quite where they need to be. Now moving on from there, I'll talk about the tsuba. One is like a more elaborate looking fitting. One is a simpler looking fitting with some cutouts symbolizing like a Tsukashi style, I believe it is, just this iron tsuba cutout with a silhouetted shape to it. And they're stylistically, whichever one you happen to like is fine. One's a very classic shape, this crane themed tsuba is a very classical shape. However, the other is an Oni katana. At least that's where I recognize it from, is the Hanwei Oni katana. So it gives me a little bit of pause, because I'm pretty sure that's intellectual property of Hanwei, but I'm seeing it on a number of different swords out there, so maybe they sold, I don't know. But either way, like, I remember it from the Hanwei Oni katana. I love the fittings, don't get me wrong. I think the Oni katana is really, really fun looking fittings. I love the demon faces, but I would like to see, I appreciate it when vendors have their own fittings, something that is bespoke to them, that can only be had with their wares, and that is unique to their swords. And there's a variety of historical shapes to copy. I understand that many draw from like similar parts bins, but it'd be kind of neat if there were a little bit more bespoke fittings going on here. Apart from that, the tsubas all fit on fine. I didn't have any complaints about any one of them, and you know, they look the way they do. None of them bit into my hands, none of them were uncomfortable, and they all have shapes and sizes and themes that you either will like or not, based on your own subjective appreciation of Japanese style art and its reproduction in tsuba. I'm babbling. Okay, I'm going to move on to the scabbards here. The scabbards are simple wood scabbards, no horn fittings, not expecting much in this price point. What did throw me off though was the sageo. So on the initial set that was sent, it came with these relatively thick, very long sageo, which were really, really nice, because one of the styles of martial arts that I study is Toyama Ryu, and you have this, having long sageo in that style is rather handy, because you move it around and tie it to the front of the strands or the bindings for your hakama, and little short nubby sageo don't feel as good, don't give you as much room to move around. So having a longer sageo anyway in that particular style is one thing that I happen to like. And the first set of swords came with this very light, nice long sageo. Well, the other set of swords came with this kind of shoestring sageo. And it's a concern here, since with these separate samples, this thing that I liked is different from one sword to the other. So I would prefer to have the longer one, but if I were to buy this sword and do a review on one, and then the next one came with a shoestring, that would be a downside, and it would cost, you know, $10-15 to buy a longer sageo. So I'd love to see consistency on the fittings, the materials that are used, the length of the sageo, the quality of it. I believe that consistency could be improved. The rest of it, though, the sayas all fit reasonably well. They drew reasonably well. They did all the things that scabbards are supposed to do. They're not particularly elaborate. They don't taper very much, but they're simple, black. The paint on them is nice. They didn't chip particularly easily, and they drew and sheathed reasonably well. They weren't raspy or twisted or broken or anything else like that. Now I'm going to talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part, and there's a little bit to unpack here. Now, all four swords came with effectively the same kind of shape. They're all about the same length. They all have a bohie on them, and they're all made of steel. One is differentially hardened. The other are through hardened. Now, the through hardened blades don't have a hamon. There's nothing particularly special about them. It's advertised as a manganese steel, but I don't know exactly which or what one it is. It just says manganese steel on their website, and it's supposed to be through hardened. So you don't see much of any metallurgical effects in the blade. It has more or less like a little less than a mirror polish, and from there you can't really see much. There's no hata, there's no hamon, there's no banding effects to really appreciate in the steel. The bohie is also not particularly elaborate or terminated in a way that is overly interesting or anything like that. But it came sharp, and it came, you know, well enough to do any kind of training or anything like that you might want to do with it. As well as the sharpness and edge held up reasonably well. When I was cutting into some of the various targets out there, it didn't chip or anything like that very easily. And that can be said of all four swords. None of them broke or were easy to chip or seemed really odd in terms of like edge retention or anything like that. Now, the differentially hardened one, though, has some oddness to it. The first one that I got had this polish on it that was really zazzy and had a lot of character in it for a sword at $130. It was one of the cooler, zazzier looking hamons that I've seen on a Chinese reproduced sword. There's been a lot of cool hamons. This one just happens to be really fun, and the fact that you could get it on a $130 sword really, really surprised me. I thought it was fantastic until I got the second sample, and it lost all of that character. It had just kind of a cloudy looking hamon, and it didn't have any of the same depth that the first one did. So again, I'm seeing these things where there's slight differences in the kind of sheen on the fittings. That's not a big deal. I'm seeing slight differences in the tightness of the ito. Not that big a deal, especially since the second set was better. But I'm seeing differences in the sageo. That's a problem. I would, you know, those should be the same part. They should be consistent. And I'm seeing a really big difference in the polish of the differentially hardened blade. That, again, should be consistent. The first one was great. The second one was meh. And it's not that I'm expecting a lot for $130, but that first one was a really special looking hamon, and I would have said, if you want a zazzy looking piece and you're on a budget, this is, you know, an excellent place to look, a real differentiator. The second one, though, kind of blends into the rest of the stuff out there. And so consistency is, again, a point that I'll make about things that could be improved on. But all the swords came sharp, they came rust-free, and they all actually, I think, held up reasonably well. So the first ones that I was testing, I was doing EI, and I noticed the Koshirae issue, and so that was the first set that I used. The second one I practiced as well, did a little bit of EI, noticed the same Koshirae-related issues, and then I brought the second set to do some more aggressive stuff, you might say. So I cut water bottles, I cut all manner of things, and I can say that apart from the Koshirae coming loose, all of them cut really well, actually. I was surprised at how effectively they cut. They had very keen edges, the sharpening on them was very good. They popped pool noodles apart, they popped water bottles apart, and I didn't notice any edge damage. I kind of was whacked it into the top of beer cans and things like that, just to see if I could get the edge to roll or deflect a little bit. None of it seemed to have any issue whatsoever. Now, in pushing the differentially hardened blade to failure, it, as you might imagine, differentially hardened blades, they have a little bit better edge retention perhaps, but they tend not to hold up to some of the really abusive stuff that I did or tend to do. So it took a bend a little bit easier. If I slapped it into the side of the stand, it would take a bend. Common for differentially hardened blades. When I straightened it back out, I could still cut with it and do all that kind of stuff. But when I brought it to the croquet stake of doom, it took 5 pretty light whacks and I was diminishing the edge. But when I did harder strikes, it took another 4 or 5 of them before it broke. Now, a good sign for a differentially hardened blade is if I have to turn it around and start hitting the spine, that is an indicator that it's at least to me, a little bit stronger a sword. In this case, it broke sooner than I would have expected, but do bear in mind it made it to the croquet stake of doom, which is a bit of an accomplishment in and of itself. The through hardened blade, though, was exhibiting some strange things when I went to the more aggressive side of testing. They cut water bottles and pool noodles and, you know, the simple backyard fun stuff reasonably well, but when I went to test it in terms of bending, I was really surprised that it would take a set. Now, it's advertised, the through hardened variety, as manganese steel. I don't know what that means, but this acts a lot like 440, or I'm sorry, not 440, 1045. It's acting a lot like the 1045 katanas that I've tested in the past, where it has decent edge retention, the edge stays sharp, it's overall well made, but it kind of takes a set and doesn't spring back into shape as easily. And it struck me as a lighter sword. And also when I was bashing it on the croquet stake of doom, it really took a lot to break. And the examples of swords that I've had that have been as wiggly as this, or as challenging to break, while simultaneously doing it badly, have all been 1045 related blades. So what I mean by that is I'm hitting into the stake and it's not breaking, but the blade is bending, it's deforming, it's going out of shape, but it's just not breaking. So it's soft, the edges are rolling, it's not holding up well, it's maintaining itself as a weapon of a sort, but not particularly well. And eventually I did get it to break, but it required me taking the other sword, really diminishing the edge and spine, and then hitting it very hard. It took a lot to break, but it also was deforming quite a bit, and it seemed like it was softer than a typical through-hardened katana would be. Ideally, with through-hardened blades, when I strike them on the side, they spring back into shape. This one, deforming, hitting on the croquet stake of doom, and then like recurving almost is not necessarily a great sign. It seems like the heat treatment as well could be improved a little bit here. I don't want you to confuse it didn't break with it did well not breaking. In this case, it was very challenging to break, but not in a way that really lended itself to being a durable weapon, if that makes sense. Not that breaking in half is better, but hopefully you get what I mean. It seems like it's a little soft. Anyway, that's all the bits and bobs and fits and features, close-ups, usage, breaking that I can share with you. Hopefully at this point you have some idea if this is worth your hard-earned money or not. I'm going to answer that question myself, though. Do I personally think it's worth the money? Yes and no. So for $129, the first sample that I got, even with loose ito, I thought was worth it. It had an absolutely beautiful hamon with some depth and coolness and a polish that I don't normally see, and it's something that I can imagine if I was on a budget and I wanted a cool looking sword and I wanted something to like take out and appreciate. The hamon on that was just absolutely lovely to look at. It was so fun. It was fun to cut with, and granted the Koshirae came off, but you know, it had cool oni katana fittings. If I bought it for $129, sprayed it with some lacquer, got some super glue under the Koshirae, that would be a really fun sword to have around and to look at. Still got some things that I'm not a super fan about, but I think that hamon was cool enough to say, yes, I would think that would be worth it. However, the rest of them, the second sample of that and the differentially hardened blades kind of acting a little weird in the testing, I would say no, there's some improvement that needs to happen both in consistency as well as the heat treatment before I would say, even at this kind of very cost-effective realm of things, that it would be a recommendation. And that's only because as a customer, you are very fortunate to live in a time where there are a ton of really awesome options out there for under $200. There's a number of companies pining for your dollar, and I just think a few more of them nip and tuck a few things better. However, a Swordier is nearly there. The coolness of the polish demonstrated that they're capable. The style of the fittings that they're using, if you happen to like them, I'm a fan of the oni katana pieces. If they nail down some consistency and tighten up ito, these will absolutely be a contender for your dollar and offer something a little unique and special that you don't often see, as in a really bold, zazzy polish. Anyway, that's what I have to share with you. Hopefully it's been helpful. I want to thank the folks at Swordier for sending these swords my way for review. Hopefully it was helpful. Cheers, and thanks for watching.